Welcome to Not So New News, where we discover what is hidden in the newspapers from 100 years ago. Today's article comes from the town of Whitesburg and appeared in Letcher County's oldest newspaper, the Mountain Eagle. Volume 2, number 18, dated December 31st, 1908. This reading is from the writings done in 1908. These views are from that time period and do not necessarily reflect the modern views of Kentucky Tennessee living nor its narrator. However, we feel that all historical documents must be preserved for the future and strive not to change one word of the reading. However, if we feel that the readings are too controversial in political or religious standing, we will either silently put the article up for viewing or will direct everyone to where it can be found online. Thank you for your understanding. This is a very unusual posting in the Mountain Eagle. We can only surmise that either Burdine Webb liked the story as relayed by William Rain, or that this was going to be a new running feature in the Mountain Eagle for 1909. While this is not newsworthy per se, it is interesting that this article was printed and considered entertainment at that time. In 1909, the only entertainment available was live plays, concerts, shows, books, newspapers, and magazines. While the radio was invented in 1895, it is very doubtful that this technology had reached Letcher County yet, as we have not found any evidence of a radio station near that location. And now, back to our story. The First Quarrel by William McLeod Rain. Copyright by Ford Publishing Company. It was Carol Miles herself that answered Larry's ring. Quote, "Hello?" Unquote, he said, cheerily unloading his golfing paraphernalia at the hall tree. Quote, "Why didn't you show up at the links?" Unquote. She viewed him with an unimpressive disapproval. Quote, "I waited for you for an hour." Unquote. Quote, "Waited? Oh, I am so sorry, but I don't understand." Unquote. He offered his surprised explanation in the form of a question. Quote, "Didn't you ask Miss Sloane to tell me to go out with them because you had some letter to finish and that you would come out later with Mrs. Loudon?" Unquote. Her answer was emphatic. Quote, "I did not." "Did she tell you that?" Unquote. Quote, "Yes, at least I thought she did. I must have misunderstood her." Unquote, answered Larry. Quote, "It is easy to misunderstand when one wants to." Unquote, contributed Mrs. Miles, her chin tilted aggressively. Quote, "Oh, come, Carol, that's not fair." Unquote, protested Larry. Quote, "Let's straighten out the tangle. What did you tell Mrs. Sloane?" Unquote. Quote, "She came in and asked me if I were going to the links. Well, I couldn't tell her that I had written you a note asking you to meet me here and go out with me, and that I didn't know whether I was going or not until you came." Unquote. Mrs. Miles paused, exasperated. Quote, "So I told her I had some letters to write, as I had, and after I would finish them, I would come out with Mrs. Loudon. As she was going away, I told her that she might meet you out there. I meant her to think, when she saw us, that we just happened to meet." Unquote. Quote, "I met them in the rig. She told me to jump in with them, that you said that you would come later with Mrs. Loudon, and that I would be out there. She must have misunderstood." Unquote. Mrs. Miles did not appear convinced. Quote, "She is in the habit of misunderstanding too many things." Unquote. Quote, "I do not think that is quite just to her. She is a first-rate sort, and not the least bit tricky." Unquote, said Larry, foozling badly. Quote, "Oh, I know you appreciate her, but I object to being placed in the humiliating position you put me in between you this afternoon." Unquote. The tilt to Mrs. Carroll's chin was even more accentuated than before. Quote, "It is an insult to a girl to be kept waiting an hour for a man who does not intend to come. And it is especially humiliating when she asked him to go with her, instead of him asking her. It hurts her pride, and I should think if a man had the least bit of consideration, he would be careful not to let any girl he cared for get into that position." Unquote. Quote, "I'm awfully sorry, Carol. It happened so. But don't you see my point of view? I thought you had sent express directions to me not to wait for you. I didn't know just why you had changed your mind. But since you had, I thought it was up to me to honor your wishes in the matter." Unquote. Quote, "And go off with Mrs. Sloane while I poked here alone for 2 hours, wondering why you had not come?" Unquote. Quote, "I thought that was what you had sent me word to do." Unquote. Quote, "Well, I think it was very inconsiderate of you, but I don't care to talk about it any more. Did you have a pleasant time? What was your score?" Quote, "Aren't you a little unreasonable?" Unquote, asked Larry, getting nettled. Quote, "No, I don't think that I am the least bit unreasonable, but I don't want to talk about it any more. It's a matter of no importance." Unquote. Quote, "Just as you please. Only I think it to be of considerable importance that we can't explain away a little misunderstanding like that without your getting miffed. You must know that I am not in the least to blame. But since you say it doesn't matter, we'll change the subject." Unquote. Very jauntily. Quote, "Yes, I had a pleasant time. My score was 19. Unquote. Quote, "That's good. I should think that you would golf more with Mrs. Sloane. You make such good scores when you are with her." Unquote. Her manner was very official. Quote, "And she's a first-rate sort, you know." Unquote. He reverted abruptly to the order of the day. Quote, "I don't know. It's quite playing the game for you to try to deceive Mrs. Sloane and then be offended because she was deceived." Unquote. Quote, "Oh, I know her little ways. Just as soon as she saw you, she understood the situation exactly. But she saw in a flash that she had a decent pretext for pretending not to. It was very like her not to miss her chance. Not that I mind in the least, only I don't like to be made a fool of. It's humiliating." Unquote. Quote, "Well, commend me to a woman's reasoning for the strangest logic that ever was created. You invent a little," and here the word is a little too fuzzy to read, "to deceive Mrs. Sloane. She falls into it completely, and then you turn around and say that she's making a fool of you." Unquote. Quote, "You certainly defend her most ardently. Your friend would be pleased at the enthusiasm of her champion." Unquote. Quote, "She is your friend too, and I want to be just." Unquote, he answered with youthful dignity. Quote, "Implying, of course, I am most unjust." Unquote. Quote, "You are saying that, not I." Unquote, he flung back. Quote, "We've said enough. I don't want to talk about it any more." Unquote. Quote, "All right. Of course you have made up your mind that you are entirely right and that we are all wrong." Unquote. The girl gulped down a sob and looked at him piteously. Quote, "We're quarreling, Larry." Unquote. Quote, "I guess we are." Unquote, he assented gloomily, his elbows on his knees and his chin in his hands. Quote, "And we said we never would." Unquote, her eyes were hot and moist. Quote, "That's right." Unquote. Quote, but it isn't right for you to be as aggravating as you are, unquote. Quote, I guess you are tired out and not feeling very well, Carol, unquote, he suggested. Quote, I'm nothing of the kind, unquote, she protested. Quote, I'm as well as I ever was in my life, and I'm not cross either, unquote. He smiled. Quote, then you must be mistaken. We can't be quarreling. It takes two to make a quarrel, unquote. Quote, not if you're one of them, Larry, and you'd rub an angel the wrong way till you had ruffled its temper, unquote. Quote, her temper, you mean, my dear, unquote. She pouted. Quote, I'm not your dear, unquote. Quote, I use the term in a Pickwickian sense, my dear, unquote. She dimpled, then promptly extinguished that charming signal of readiness to forgive him for her fault. Quote, you said it again, but, of course, you can't believe it, since you think me ugly and jealous and unreasonable, unquote. Quote, oh, I didn't say that, unquote, he reproached. Her eyes opened wide with astonishment. Quote, you did, sir, and I guess it's true. I was horrid, Larry, unquote. The tears were welling over now, unrestrained. Larry somehow found himself very close to her. Quote, no, you weren't, dear girl. You didn't understand, and I don't think I explained it very well. But you know I wouldn't slight you for anything in the world. Don't you, Carol? Unquote. Quote, I guess so, unquote. The voice came faint and muffled from his coat. Quote, and you know that Mrs. Sloane and I are always rowing, though, of course, we are friendly enough. Our points of view are as divergent as possible. Fact is, there's miles between us, unquote, he punned. Quote, and you really do forgive me for being horrid, unquote. Quote, forgive you? If you really were horrid, as you call it, I am delighted. I don't want to marry an angel. I have been hunting for some flaw in you a month, unquote. Quote, well, you found one, Larry, a great big one, unquote. Quote, it's microscopic, if it exists at all, dear. But such as it is, I'm awfully grateful for it. The vast difference between us seems lessened, just a little bit, if you're not quite perfect, sweet, unquote. Quote, how perfectly lovely you do wrap things up, Larry. It's dear to have you do it, even when they're not so, unquote. Dimples missed smiles. Quote, once Jenny Sloane said that you were the nicest, unquote. Quote, oh, hang Miss Sloane, unquote, interrupted Larry ungallantly. Quote, let's call this a twosome and cut her out, unquote. Quote, why didn't you show up at the links, unquote. This concludes today's reading of the December 31st, 1908 Mountain Eagle. We at Kentucky Tennessee Living would like to thank you for your continued support as we bring to you the history of the Appalachian Mountains.